What I want to talk about today is this image. This, as you know, is one of the most iconic images of all time. This is by a Chinese artist named Zhu Duoqi, D-U-O-Q-I. And she has done this sort of thing with every famous painting ever, and she has way too much time on her hands. But this one is called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Pickled Cabbage. But, of course, this is what we want to talk about. The year is 1632. The artist is Rembrandt, of course, but not the Rembrandt we usually think of, not this fellow here. This is Rembrandt 1660. Rather, this fellow here. This self-portrait is from 1629. In 1632, Rembrandt is 26 years old. He was born in 1606. He will die in 1669. He's just arrived in Amsterdam, and with this commission, as it were, it is as if he were laying out his shingle. He is open for business. He's come from Leiden, with its famous Anatomical Theatre. This is from 1612 by Crispin van de Paysen. This is, by the way, an interesting image. It brings out all sorts of the ways in which you see this going on here. Dogs are always walking around. It's always related in Dutch context to moralizing lessons. So as you can perhaps see in the foreground, you have the skeleton of Adam accepting an apple from the skeleton of Eve from the twig of knowledge here. Do you see the... let's see, I'll go like this. There's all these moralizing lessons in Leiden, so that, for example, here you see Adam, the skeleton of Adam, the skeleton of Eve, the tree of knowledge with an apple. Over here you see a horse thief who has been, is on the back of it's a skeleton of a horse thief on the back of a skeleton of a horse. And the signs say things like, don't be a horse thief. And then there's all this moralizing that takes place within the context of anatomical theaters. This one, as I say, in Leiden. There has been a long time, by 1632, there's a long tradition of artists using anatomical guides. This one here is by Gillo Cesare, who died in 1616. You often have these rather remarkable people peeling their backs, as you can see with this guy. He would do both genders. These books that were made partly for doctors, but also for artists. Here's another one. Jehan Cousin, who dies in 1593. This one is actually very funny if you look at it. Note the finger, the pointing finger on the left and on the right, and in the middle. Isn't that weird? That finger there and that finger there is that finger right there. I'm just showing you how it is. There is also, by this time, a tradition of doctors, guilds of doctors who commission portraits. So you get something like this. This is Ert Peters, The Anatomy Lesson of Sebastian Ekberts in 1603. So this is 30 years before the Rembrandt painting. The great critic Harry Berger, referring to this genre, talks about the general fictitiousness of the genre. Because, of course, nobody ever got together like this and stood for the painter. This is a series of individual portraits which were done. Each of them were done separately. around. So there's a whole this kind of genre of painting has a whole kind of fiction of the pose going on. Similarly, this one here, Thomas de Keyser, the officers of the Surgical Guild in 1619. This one here, Van Meervelt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Wilhelm van der Meer in 1617. One of the things that Harry Berger talks about, and it has some pertinence to the Rembrandt, is what he calls competitive posing. That the posers all compete with each other to pose, and in some cases to be seen as not posing. This guy here wants to pose as if he's lost in thought, and who can pose most effectively at not posing is an ongoing issue in these images. Note, incidentally, that this is the more traditional way an anatomy lesson would begin. The anatomy lessons were always in the winter, and for keeping the corpse cold, but you would always start at the belly, because that was the part of the body that was decomposing the fastest. You'll remember that the same thing happened with the, again, that's the traditional way an anatomy lesson would begin in Leiden. Then we arrive at this one, and I think you'll get a sense right away of how dramatically different this is from the earlier ones. For one thing, there's a lot more drama in it. The poses are more active, or as Harry Berger says, as if active. This guy is really good at imitating being lost in thought and so forth. I'm dubious. Harry Berger makes a lot of that in this in his interpretation of the painting. I'm dubious that that's the main thing going on. What you have is Dr. Nicholas Tulp, who is the dean of the Amsterdam anatomists, this fellow here. And you basically have two pyramids of gazers. You have this group right here, who are gazing at something with great intensity. And then you have this group here, who are gazing out at us. By the way, this guy here is definitely an outlier. I suspect, turned in his subscription form late. Whenever you look at this picture, ignore this guy. He shouldn't be there. He's definitely not part of the general composition of the picture. And it's really literally as if at the end of the whole thing, somebody came to Rembrandt and said, we have to include this guy as well. The two pyramids, of course, in the middle of the whole picture, are atop the corpse. The year is January 1632. The body is that of Adrian Adriansson, who was also known as Ares Kind, and he's a petty thief. He had been executed at the age of 28 a few hours earlier for grave assault and battery that had endangered the life of a man whose cloak he was endeavoring to steal. One interpretation of this painting is that men of property are standing smugly attending a theater of what happens to someone who would upend the cult of property. In this sense, it's a throwback to the earlier tradition where after you execute someone, you flay and quarter them. The idea is that you are mortifying the body in the presence of the still present soul. In other words, not only has the person been executed, but the soul realized that the body is being disfigured in a way that after the second coming, after the resurrection, they will be forever mangled. And there is a sense in which only thieves or murderers, or in any case executed people, were allowed to be dissected in Holland. Relatively few of these dissections took place. This is the only one that took place in Amsterdam in the year 1632. And there's a critic named Miek Bal who suggests that what this painting is about is the social theater of mastery. Again, I'm not sure. I think people would know that's a thief. I think people know that there's that especially in Holland at this point, you are developing early capitalism, you are having property classes and so forth. I think that's all true. One of the things that's nice about talking about great paintings is that they are super saturated with significance. They are overdetermined, and they can bear the weight of many readings. At the end of the day, this is not the reading I want to impose on it. As I say, the dissection takes place in January to keep the corpse cool, and it takes place before a paying audience at the Vageboy in Amsterdam. That the paying audience being what the three people here are looking out at. They're looking out at us. We are standing where the audience would be. And, for example, that guy there is looking directly at us and is looking at our astonishment at what we're looking at. It's as if, actually, let me go back one. It's as if these three are absorbed in something quite remarkable, and these three are absorbed in looking at how absorbed we are in the same thing. Here I want to go with W.G. Sebald, the great German-British writer, who in his book Rings of Saturn, which is a walkabout, an excursion of the mind, at one point he goes on for several pages about this painting. And he points out, it's odd that Dr. Tulp's colleagues are not looking at Kint's body, that their gaze is directed just past it, he says, following other writers, to focus on the anatomical atlas in which the appalling physical facts are reduced to a diagram. I think he's wrong about that, by the way. I don't think that these three people are looking at this book. Although many writers say that is the favorite trope of art historical book writers, that they would all be looking astonished at a book. I don't think it's true. Nevertheless, continuing with Sebald, they focus on the anatomical atlas in which the appalling physical facts are reduced to a diagram, a schematic plan of a human being, such as envisioned by René Descartes, the enthusiastic amateur anatomist, who was also, it has been said, present that morning at this particular dissection. Now that's incredible to think about, that Descartes, who is going to write the Discourse on Method, which is the font of the mind-body dichotomy, in 1637, 5 years after that, may well have been one of the people in the audience, may well have been where we are standing in the picture. For that matter, Sebald makes a fairly strong case that another person in the room that day was Thomas Brown, the author of The Anatomy of Melancholy, who was studying medicine in the 1630s in Leiden and in Amsterdam. As he says, years later, this is now Sebald, years later, describing a great fog that shrouded both London and Holland, Brown would describe it as like the white mist that rises from within a body opened presently after death, and which during our lifetimes clouds our brain when asleep or dreaming. Now, he points out to that, he starts talking about the hand. He says, this hand is most peculiar. It is not, he's talking about the hand that's been dissected. It's not only grotesquely out of proportion compared with the hand closer to us, but it is also anatomically the wrong way round. The exposed tendons, which ought to be those of the left palm, given the position of the thumb, are in fact those of the back of the right hand. In other words, what we are faced with is a transposition taken from an anatomical atlas, such as the book, evidently without further reflection, that turns this otherwise true-to-life painting, if one may express it, into a crass misrepresentation at the exact center of its meaning, where the incisions have been made. It seems inconceivable that we are faced with an unfortunate blunder. Rather, I believe that there was a deliberate intent behind this flaw in the composition. That unshapely hand signifies the violence that has been done to Areskind, the thief. It is with him, the victim, and not the guild that gave Rembrandt the commission that the painter identifies. His gaze alone is free of Cartesian rigidity, Rembrandt's gaze alone. And he goes on in that fashion. I think the immediate thing to be said is I think he's wrong about that the anatomy is wrong. It seems to me pretty clearly that this is the right hand, the correct hand. You notice the finger coming up and so forth. And this is that those kinds of muscles, those tendons exist on both sides of the hand, as you can see from this Anatomical Atlas. I think Rembrandt has it right, in other words, at that point. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Riva Lair, who's here, an anatomist who can help me with that. But having said that, I think Sebald is absolutely right in saying that the hands constitute the very center point of the painting's meaning. This is even more the case, and again, just this little ballet of hand, 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 and it becomes even more the case when you look at this hand, because you'll notice, and you really see this very strongly when you go to The Hague to see the painting, that this hand here is slightly discolored from the rest of the arm. And it appears to be because when Kind was executed, they chopped off his hand because he was a thief. And the original version of the painting had the hand chopped off, which would have brought even more attention to the theme of hands. He apparently afterwards, Rembrandt decided to put the hand back in. But the pentimento of that decision is in the discoloration you see there. Hands, of course, having a long history in theology and art both. They're hardly a neutral sign. They've long been an object of theological marvel, the genius of a creator who could fashion such an ingenious contraption. I mean, look at it yourself. Look at your hand. And just look what you can do. This incredible number of things you can do with this hand. You can pick up the slightest thing. You can wield huge, heavy things. For theologians in the Middle Ages, it was a huge intelligent design issue that there had to be a creator to have created such a wonderful thing. But it's especially so in the language of painting. Here, of course, the very famous, and would have been famous for Rembrandt, hands from Michelangelo's creation of Adam and Eve in the Sistine Chapel. Interesting digression here, by the way, talking about anatomy and artists. Look at the cloud of being from out of which God emerges. It's been pointed out that this is absolutely the shape of a cranium, of a skull, down to the hippocampus down here, and that clearly Rembrandt would have known that. I think, for that matter, it gives a clue. I think that this is wildly speculative, but I think that Rembrandt, with this brain-like area, again, leave that guy out, is quoting that kind of composition. Anyway, returning again to the theme in another way of looking at the theme of hands, W.S. Heckscher, who is one of the top critics of this painting, writers, has suggested that Tulp wished to appear as Vesalius Redivivus of his age, as the reincarnation of the great anatomist Vesalius. And as such, when he commissioned the painting, he asked to be portrayed the way Vesalius is portrayed on the author's drawing in his famous text. So when Vesalius and Vesalius, by the way, is 1514 to 1564, and he is really the major figure in the history of artistic anatomy and medical anatomy. Anyway, when he chose to have himself portrayed in the frontispiece of his first edition, portrays himself, and by the way, his work is called the Fabric of Klaris. It's the fabric of the body is the metaphor that he keeps on using. And he portrays himself here almost like a salesman of bolts of luxurious fabric. And in this case, a luxuriously red fabric. It comes, as it says, it comes in deep crimson. Another thing, by the way, while we're on the subject of Vesalius, the point I'm trying to make is that it's possible that Tulp wanted to be seen as Vesalius of the North, and to do that he would have been portrayed this way as opposed to opening the stomach. In any case, just one other interesting side note is that the frontispiece, the very frontispiece of Vesalius's book, drawn by a pupil of Titian's, Jan van Calcetter, the book comes out in 1543, exactly 2 years after Michelangelo completed the Last Judgment of the Sistine Chapel in 1541. And it's been pointed out how similar the arrangement is in both, down to a rather remarkable thing in this detail right here. Again, this is the Last Judgment. The world has been divided into saved and people who are being kicked out. And Michelangelo himself had dissected bodies and had been extremely controversial for doing so, at one point kicked out of Rome for doing so. And in his picture, he includes his own body fleeced there. That's his face. It's kind of remarkable. Yeah, that's a sidelight. Let's get back to Rembrandt. The question I want to ask, and it's the key to the asking about this question, is what are the three people in the center staring at, if they're not staring at the book? Tulp is displaying how, with the Flexor Digitorum muscles, these muscles here, you can do in the lower arm. They are what you allow and he's showing that out with his forceps. They are what allow you to be able to move your fingers like this. And you can feel it in your own hand. If you do that, you can feel the muscles down here are what make you flex your hand. And the three fellows are looking at that dumbfounded, stilled in astonishment. It is the most amazing thing to look at. They're not looking at the muscles, just because something that's even more amazing is what's going on with the hand. Actually, if you look at this guy carefully, his gaze is going in two different directions. One eye is looking at the hand, and one eye is looking down at the. Let's go back and I'll show you that again. At the flayed. One eye, this eye here is looking at that, and that eye there is looking at the hand. It's like a movie. He's going up, down, up, down. Are they, it's an interesting question to ask, are they marveling at God's creation? And we're right on the cusp here, where things are becoming more secularized. Are they marveling at God's creation, at how incredible it is that a hand works like this? Or at man's ingenuity at having figured it all out? We are at any rate on the very cusp of the secular revolution. It's worth noting that in 1632, the year of this painting, another thing happens in Amsterdam. Spinoza is born that year. Spinoza will be the great, great secularist within a few years. At any rate, it seems to me the subject is gazing at the marvel of manipulability. Gazing at the marvel of hand, or another way of putting it, you're talking about eye and vision, which is to say you're talking about painting itself. It's worth thinking about the way that at a certain point Rembrandt was painting, had his brush painting this, and those figures were with amazement looking at the way he was painting. My technical assistant at the office, Matt Heinrich, and I put together this way of bringing that out, or rather perhaps that way. It's not an exaggeration to say that this is a celebration on top of everything else of the art and the wonder and the marvel of painting itself, a brash celebration on the part of this 26-year-old. That, by the way, is the back of the Velázquez Las Meninas canvas. Photoshop is great. Beyond that, you have astonishment at the miraculous complexity of painting and of the hand, but just generally, this is a painting about the marvel of life rather than horror at the face of inevitable death. This is far from being a morbid picture. It's a celebration of life and of the insistence on life and knowing about life and how it works. As such, it's not entirely unlike the way in which photographs such as this one from Bosnia, Dr. Eva Karnovsky. There's a photograph by Sarah Terry. And in many ways, it's a parallel photograph. It's a doctor reaching out to a hand. And this profession, when you talk to the people in Bosnia, as I did when I was reporting there, who were doing this kind of work, they are not at all obsessed with death. They are trying to repair, to let the families know, to let the ongoing life, to know who was where and so forth, to honor life rather than death. The same thing that happens in Gil Perez's slightly earlier photograph of death in The Professor. In this case, more Pieta-like, I guess. Dr. Haglund, William Haglund, in 1996, also in Bosnia. Just as a side note, when Milosevic died of a heart attack, Martin Rouse in The Guardian had this cartoon. He had died of a heart attack, and so it was. Was it suicide, murder, or heart disease? Well, it doesn't look like he had any heart. Any sign of Mladic or Karadzic in there? The two people who were still in hiding. It's worth noting as well that 1632, the year of this painting, was the exact midpoint of the 30 Years' War that was taking place next door in Germany. Horrible, horrible, horrible violence, religious violence there, much like Bosnia's violence. It would culminate end with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And it was that war which led to the writing in Holland, nearby in Delft, just a few years before this painting by Hugo Grotius, of the Great Treatise on Just Wars, which is the beginning of humanitarian law and thinking about, crimes of war and so forth. That is the book that the International Criminal Tribunal, which took place in The Hague, right near Delft, was based on, if you go back and look at the thing. It's also worth noting, speaking of Delft, that 1632 is not only the year of the birth of Spinoza, it's also the year of the birth of Vermeer. And for more of that, I have a book called Vermeer in Bosnia, which ties all of these things together. But anyway, returning back to Rembrandt. Note how similar, now this is another layer of interpretation, note how similar the man leaning over, the guy with the two eyes, is in his physiognomy to the guy who has died. One way of thinking about this is about vanitas. It's the great theme in Dutch art. You too will die someday. You could think about it that way, but it's not simply vanitas. Rather, now that we look at it again, the corpse bears a conspicuous likeness, especially with that loincloth, to the standard iconography of that other man famously executed as if a common thief, crucified, flanked by thieves, and then taken down from the cross, as in images like that. This is Montaigne's Lamentation over the Dead Christ, and there is a tremendous amount of Christian iconography just flowing just under the surface in Rembrandt, such that we say he died for our sins and he will rise again. Again, just how we participate in that. That in turn leads to a final digression that I want to make, and we'll end this fairly soon and then open it to questions and conversation. But this is a digression that comes care of my master, the great, great critic John Berger, who I like to think I've trained at the feet of. In 1967, Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia. And this picture appeared all over the world, and there were many pictures taken that day, but for some reason this is the one that people over and over again put on the covers of their newspapers. And within a few weeks, John Berger said that we all know what this he wrote an article where he said, we all know what this picture is based on. The image as if hot-wired in their brains that taught the generals where to stand and the photographer where to place his vantage point. This photograph is based on Rembrandt's anatomy lesson. I remember at the time thinking, God, this guy does not read the newspaper the way I read the newspaper. And this is an interesting way to read the newspaper. It is worth noting, though, specifically about this, that it's key to the image, to this whole iconography working, that on the day that he died, Che looked like this. Had he looked like this, it wouldn't have worked. Does anybody know who that is? My favorite, people said Desi Arnaz, which I think is pretty good. That's Che. That is Che a few years earlier, who disguised himself as an Argentinian businessman for his passport photo so he could go to the Congo. Had he looked like this, I don't think it would have worked. But because he looked like this, by way of this, through that, to this, you get this. And then later, this. And then later, that. That being the tenor of our age. I'm not in any way, speaking of the tenor of our age, this reminds me of my favorite chant at the Jon Stewart rally. You heard the crowd chanting, 3-word phrase. 3-word phrase. This is not a good sign for politics in our time, but I think it's an accurate one, actually. To be clear, I'm not talking here through this entire little excursus, this John Berger excursus, about the ideological or political value or lack thereof of Che's worldview. I'm talking rather about how images prepare the ground for other images. We see images by way of images we've already seen. Anyway, just return. With this image, we are, in summary, we're at an incredibly interesting locus, a nexus in the history of civilization. We are at a time when religion, medicine, and law have not yet bifurcated. So that, for example, you have an execution, the whole law, all the stuff about property and so forth, but that is all taking place within the context of iconography of Christianity, of moralizing lessons, religion, and medicine is also beginning to come out of all this, all these systems of control, the kind of thing that Foucault writes about. It's interesting when you think about this, the different kinds of words that one talks about. For example, the word diet, which means what you eat, but it's also, when you would have a conclave of the church, it was called a diet. The words are the same. One of my favorite book titles of all time was a book I was assigned in college called Martin Luther's Progress to the Diet of Worms, which I thought was a great title. But similarly, if you think about regimen, what is your exercise regimen and so forth, and the word regime, or the proper constitution of the body, of a body politic. It's worth noting that Hobbes was born in 1588. He was 44 in 1632. He's well on his way to writing the Leviathan, which will come out in a few years, in 1651. In any case, what all is being talked about here is the relationship of the body and the body politic, which I hope has been one of the themes of this entire festival. And in the context of it all, in Amsterdam in 1632, a 26-year-old painter is bringing them all together masterfully, which is to say, law, medicine, religion, transubstantiated into art. So now we can turn the lights back on and we can talk about it. Anybody have any questions? Or, yeah, right there.
Where is the doctor looking Or where do you think he's looking?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let's go back and take a look at him. My sense, he may be looking up at, if it's in fact a physical amphitheater, which may be the case, he's looking up at like I'm looking up there. It may also be the sense that he's lost in thought, I sometimes think. He's saying, or the way in which you look up at the sky when you're feeling yourself feeling something. See, with these muscles here, you can do this. I think that may be going on. It's absolutely the kind of thing that I urge people to actively. I mean, part of what I was doing here was talking about what it's like to actively engage with a picture, and it's worth pursuing and coming up with fanciful thoughts. A major thing I want to say about this style of criticism, and for that matter, this style of running a festival, is take it or leave it. Try it, see whether it works, push it a little bit further. If you don't like that, try this other thing. I never got a PhD. I stopped at a BA, and thereby was saved the horror of academic discipline. And what's your proof? What's your footnote? Well, no. On the contrary, we loose, as long as you're modest about it. Don't claim. And I think part of what I was trying to do here was show that you can have 10 different interpretations. Some of them are mutually exclusive, and the great thing about being alive is you can entertain them all for a while. Yeah.
Hello. Do you think the open book may have some reference to the Protestant Reformation, in that the Protestants did away with all the sacraments except for baptism and I believe baptism and Eucharist, but not extreme unction. That was a papist thing. Could the open book have a reference to that?
Well, if you think that, give her the microphone back because I have to ask her a question. Do you think the open book in that case is a Bible?
No, but just sort of a droll reference to the good book.
Right. I mean, I tend to agree with the notion that probably is an anatomical book that they're using, and that he's at a certain point looked at it and made reference to it. But I agree. I like the idea of punning off of the Bible, and that would be in the room, in the air of the picture. This thing here, by the way, this piece of paper that he's looking out at us, and he has this piece of paper, and it happens that on the piece of paper are the names of the people in the picture who commissioned the picture. And apparently, the very last squeeze in at the bottom, you need better eyes than I do, and the light shouldn't be on, is the name of this guy here. So that's further evidence that he was an interloper. As somebody who runs a festival, I know exactly this feeling. Oh, darn. We didn't have a seat for that person. Oh, no. Let's rearrange the seating. But anyway, thank you for that. Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk about the three who are looking out at us.
Uh-huh. It's interesting. My feeling about the three, I mean, this guy here is hawk-like, even as, he's really got us nailed. This guy here is much softer, and one of the things he's doing with his hand, in a very mild way, is pointing at what the subject of the picture is. Look at how cool he is. Look at this thing. This guy here looks as if he's just turned to see us. That we dropped something in the room. And he's just turned around to see something that's happened. But again, one of the things that's so fascinating when you compare it to those Rembrandts, the earlier ones, where everybody's just looking out at you and that kind of competitive posing and kind of blandness of uniformity. There's just all kinds of drama going on, even in that, it seems to me. This guy here, by the way, is a kind of fogginess, or what would be the word, that you associate with later Rembrandt when he begins to, when you get a soulfulness in the picture, precisely by the lack of exactitude. This guy here is more the kind of piercing gaze. This guy here has a little bit too much camphor or something earlier in the day. Any other questions?
The corpse's face is not completely seen, and nobody seems to be looking at his face. Mm-hmm. Do you see any significance in that?
Well, That's definitely the case, and I would think, and we had Billy Hayes here last week, who talks about anatomical dissections, and in fact, in a second, the next question we should take from Riva down here, who in a second, because she has her hand up, but she also is president at Anatomical Dissections as an artist in residence for 4 years. My impression is that there is this whole kind of not looking death in the face thing that goes on in these things. One of the things that's fascinating about this, by the way, is the way in which there's this incredible glow of the body, as his light is coming out of the body as the subject, except the face. It happens that there's a reason for that, the shadow and so forth, but what's specifically shadowed are his eyes, as if almost a curtain has been put over the eyes, or a cloth. But actually, can we get a microphone to Riva? I'll ask you a question, Riva. Some of you were present at Riva's remarkable talk last week on beauty and variation, but you have been at anatomy dissections. How do people respond to the face of the person being dissected?
Well, it's wrapped until very late in the process, so most of the time, through almost all of musculoskeletal, the hands and the face are actually wrapped, and that's relatively recent as a sign of respect for the fact that, at least in contemporary times, they're donated bodies. They're generally self-donated or family-donated, so it's an act of kind of privacy that when you first invade the cadaver's body, that you're not invading their selfhood in a way, and also it's very disturbing for beginning med students to encounter the body as a person. So it's
and the personhood of a body is the face.
Right, the personality is the face and the hands. Yeah. But we talked about this the other day, and saying it big, I'm seeing something else going on. Uh-huh. There's a few things. First off, in terms of the hand, I think what's going on with the dissected hand is that it's correct, except that what he's done is remove the palmar, the thenar eminence, and the retinaculum for compositional reasons, partly. Because really, if you tugged on it without the retinaculum, you'd get this kind of, it doesn't move the way that it does when that's in place, it's holding it down. But I think that because all the compositional stuff is all these circles and curves, that we have this one straight line that makes it more dramatic that would be lost. If all
by the way, as he's doing this, as Dr. Tulp is doing this, as he pulls those muscles, would it be doing something in the hand itself?
It would be doing something. It would be doing something a little different than when it's stabilized. But I think partly it's compositional. But and the other couple things about the head and the hand is that he's totally off proportion with that added hand. I was trying to figure out if he was actually had some form of dwarfism because of where his fingers were hitting in relation to the hip, but if that was an added hand. But the head is left of where it should be. And so I was trying to figure out if he was also decapitated. And then if we're just not...
Or I think he was hung, but I think that may have moved things over.
Well, sometimes hanging, the head will actually detach from the body in hanging.
Really?
Yeah, it'll actually sever.
It's also, by the way, true of Che's head. In the Che picture, the same thing happens, and Che had been decapitated before they took the picture.
But the big thing I saw in seeing this, particularly with the trio in the middle, is that if you track everybody's gaze, what you're actually getting is cream of life. That in the trio in the center, you've got one guy who's definitely looking at the hand, one guy who's in the middle of changing his gaze from the book to the hand, and the guy, the lower right, he is looking at the book.
You think so?
So I think he is looking at the book. And so what
them's
I think
them's fighting words.
Yeah, well,
I'll meet you out back.
But what I think he's actually doing in all these gazes is, in photographic blur, that we're getting this sense of something moving in the picture. What he's trying to do is actually, in the eyes alone, get the feeling of life going on. So all these people are... As we're tracking their gaze, our eye is shifting all over the place, and we're watching all of them change in response to what the doctor is saying. And I think that also is one reason why we have this really weird thing of the guy with his neck craned out over the corpse. As I think that it's life dominant over death, because if you zoom into that and you see the eye of the corpse, you can barely see the pupil of the corpse or the shape of the eyeball, and it is looking straight up. So if we imagine that as a living person who'd be looking right up under this guy's head, he'd also be feeling his breath. And you can kind of track the collar coming down to the mouth. And so we're thinking about the absent breath, so that you have this dominant life craning forward over the actual experience of death. So anyway, I'll tell you other stuff later, but
one last question. Do people who take anatomy lessons look at this picture? I mean, people who are doctors?
People who aren't in med school
don't look at pictures.
Don't look at pictures. Walk around looking like someone just hit them with a sledgehammer most of the time.
Other questions? Thank you.
I will agree with her comments about the face and hands. As when I was a medical student, the face was always covered, and it wasn't until we got to the hand that it actually dawned on me that this was a human being that we were working on.
Really? Why do you suppose that is, by the way?
I think it's the hand that separates us from most animals, and what we can do with it and what we have done with it. The fact that we can oppose thumbs, that we can write, that we can make music, we can paint.
So in some sense, would I be right to say that the hand makes you realize this was a living person who had a life, but that it would be the face that makes you realize who it was, a specific person, yeah? Sartre has this wonderful essay on faces where he's trying to figure out what is a face. And, he says, how is a face different than a belly or a thigh? And he talks about how it's filled with voracious holes, eyes, ears, mouth, and so forth. But beyond that, the face is a bit of the future that has just entered the room. The face is facing the forward, is facing the world, is coming into being in the world, and is ourselves breasting the world. And whereas that's not true if just a belly or a leg or something is being looked at. It is the locus. The future is about as close as Sartre ever gets to talking about a soul. And so it's the locus of futurity, I guess.
Any more questions? What is the evidence that Descartes was there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been trying to look that up. For right now, Sebald makes the point that Descartes is in Amsterdam at that time, and he is an anatomist, which we know, and that he is obsessing specifically at that moment about mind-body stuff, and so he makes the leap that he was there. I'm not sure about that. We know that Descartes, in his own writing, has written about being present at anatomy dissections, and we know that this was the only one that took place in Amsterdam at that year. So it's a stretch, but good enough for all practical purposes, I always say. Not good enough for PhD dissertation.
What do you think Michelangelo was saying when he drew God inside a coronal section of the human brain?
Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's clearly obvious that he's doing that, it seems to me. Well, we are in the heart of the Renaissance and in the heart of taking what had been medieval, had been given over to God, the emphasis on God, and there's more and more emphasis on, rather than think about God, think about God's creature and marvel at, you don't pray to God, you marvel at the amazing complexity of human essence. Keep in mind this is also taking place in a church, the chapel, and this is on this terrain that is going to lead more and more to, one of the things that's always fascinating with the history of humanity is you go from transposition, where that old phrase that God created man in his own image, and man returned the favor. And this sense, when you don't understand what's going on, you imagine there must be a God in control of it. And then you have more and more technology to celebrate God, more and more elaborate, beautiful images, buildings, and so forth. And at a certain point, you run the slippage of wait, that's Michelangelo is a great painter. It's not God who's great. Michelangelo is great, and I think that we're at that tipping point with that picture where what is great about God is the brilliance, the cerebral brilliance of creation of all this, and that gets represented as braininess or something, which would not have been the thing that you would have focused on about God if you were in 1300 or 1200. It's something that is happening more on the dawn of the Renaissance, it seems to me. I'm not sure. What do you think?
I think it's a sarcastic comment. I think he's saying that man invented God. God resides inside man's brain because we thought him up.
Could have been. Could be.
In order to make this painting, Rembrandt, as an artist, it seems, must have been a student of the doctor to have the knowledge of what the doctor was doing. Was there a go-between between Dr. Tulp and Rembrandt over a period of time, whereas Rembrandt painted these parts, the doctor came and taught him what these meanings were?
I don't know the answer biographically to that. There may well be biographical data on that. What I will say is that Rembrandt comes from Leiden, as I told you before, which is a hotbed of anatomical research, the theater in Leiden. And he has, in 1630, just arrived in this is one of the first paintings he does in Amsterdam, announcing his arrival. Having said that, I have no doubt that after the commission and so forth, he would have spent a lot of time with Dr. Tulp, partly figuring out what do you want me to do, how should we agree on image and so forth. But beyond that, there's no question that he would have been fascinated, I would guess, and that fascination is shown in the painting. But just biographically, he's only just shown up in Amsterdam, so I don't think he would have been spending too much time with Dr. Tulp before that. Maybe one more question?
I wonder, is there some, in a sense, all this interest in dissection is a new way of looking at the human body. And I'm wondering, is there some way to connect this new way of looking at the human body with how we react to the idea of cutting off a person's hand for those kind of legal reasons? And could there be a comment about that in Rembrandt's drawing our attention to the added-on hand?
It's not inconceivable. It is fascinating in terms of the history of anatomy that Galen, for example, did not do human dissections. He dissected monkeys and so forth. And that this is an area of great, great contention for 200 years about whether you can do it or not. In fact, Vesalius, the man we saw with the fabric of the body, he dies prematurely, of the plague in the Holy Lands, or it might have been malaria or something he contracts in the Holy Lands. And the question is, why is he on a pilgrimage to the Holy Lands? And apparently, the story goes, that he was doing a human dissection, had been given permission to do it by the court, by Charles I of Spain, and that apparently the heart started beating on the corpse he was dissecting. And this is exactly the kind of thing that drove the church crazy, that this is the kind of thing that's going to happen. And when it happened, there was a trial. He was sentenced to death for this, and the king commuted the sentence and allowed him to go to Holy Land as his punishment. He went and unfortunately died while he was on that trip. But everything is up for grabs during this period, for the 100 years before and the 100 years after, before it becomes just something that's okay to do. And in answer to your question about that it may well be that the hand is conspicuously there for people who saw it at the time. It was conspicuously there when they know it wasn't there, and that may have been not a question that there was some commentary going on in that. Anyway, well, listen, thank you so much. I just want to say to this audience that it's just been a pleasure.